What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 164 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about another volume of The Authority. This is written by Warren Ellis and Mark Millar and drawn by Brian Hitch and Frank Quietly. Not together. Warren Ellis and Brian Hitch did one story in this book, and then Mark Millar and Frank Quietly did another story in this book. And the first story has this very large alien presence that the Authority believes was the previous owner of planet Earth, and it left for however million years, and then they are coming back to Earth, and they see humanity as this very large infection. So this very large alien presence is trying to unterraform Earth and basically get rid of humanity in the process so that the planet will be livable once again for this very large alien presence that the Authority believes is the closest thing they have to God. And so the Authority has to stop this thing from unterraforming Earth. And once again, Warren Ellis and Brian Hitch, they up the ante in a way that you wouldn't expect. After stopping this evil terrorist guy from blowing up cities, they had to up the ante, so then they go to an interplanetary multiversal invasion from another universe, and then from there they have to have the Authority fight this thing that is larger than the moon. So I really like this story. I really like that for the first time in this series, I feel like some of these characters actually start to feel like they're coming alive, specifically Ginny Sparks, who is probably my favorite character in this series. I really like the idea of century babies. I like that idea from Planetary, and also here, Warren Ellis is playing with it in both books. I really like the idea of the century babies, and I really like that Ginny Sparks is, spoilers, having to deal with her own mortality, because this series started in 1999, and Ginny Sparks, as well as characters like Elijah Snow and Axel Brass from Planetary, they were all born on the year 1900, January 1st, 1900, and so she is coming up on her 100th birthday, and since Ginny Sparks is the spirit of the 20th century, that means that she is not going to live into the 21st century. And yes, it's a little silly because the 21st century doesn't start until 2001, but Warren Ellis kind of pokes fun at that a little bit and says it's the planet that's counting, it's not humanity, so that was a little silly. But Ginny Sparks basically has to deal with her own mortality. She has to figure out, okay, am I going to be able to save the human race with my dying breath? I really like the way that this book sends off the character of Ginny Sparks. And it's very fitting because this is a character that Warren Ellis created, and it almost feels like he's saying, okay, I'm going to leave the Authority in Mark Millar's hands, but I'm not going to leave him Ginny Sparks. He can't have her, he can have the rest of these guys, but Ginny Sparks is kind of like my version of this character, so I don't want him playing with her. And in a lot of ways, I could very easily see Ginny Sparks kind of being a female avatar of Warren Ellis. She's a curmudgeon, just like Warren Ellis, but at the end of the day, she also has a little bit of hope for humanity, also kind of like Warren Ellis. It's very touching the way that he sends this character off. And then in the next story we have, by Millar and Frank Quietly, I may be mispronouncing Mark Millar's name. It's spelled M-I-L-L-A-R, so I've always said Millar, but then I've heard other people say that it's supposed to be Miller, so I don't know. If I'm mispronouncing it, I apologize. But anyway, this next story, the Authority has basically started meddling in normal human affairs. So, for example, if there is an evil government that is dealing with slave trafficking or something like that, then the Authority is going to come in and they are going to kill the dictator of that third world, and then they're going to say, now you guys behave, we're going to be watching you. Basically, they have decided that they have superpowers, and there is no excuse for them to just sit back and do nothing and only fight mad scientists and alien invaders. They feel like they can actually make the world a better place by meddling in human policies around the world. And that makes them very popular with some people and also very unpopular with other people. And it's a very logical step to take this series, but it also makes it very difficult to write this series, I imagine, because these things are still happening in the real world. This comic was written in like 2000, and we still have evil people in power in the real world. So it makes it a little bit hard to digest whenever the Authority is able to just knock down the door of some evil bad guy who's ruling some country somewhere and then drop him off of a building and then the day is saved. It makes it really hard to digest that when evil is not that easily confronted in the real world. This very quickly becomes its own world, other than the fact that there are superheroes running around in a giant spaceship that is like 35 miles long. Other than that, it makes it feel like a very different world than what this series was set in initially. Having said that, it is a logical conclusion to go with based on what Warren Ellis was doing with the characters previously. Now, I'm not sure if Warren Ellis would have gone in this direction if he had stayed on the book, but that's neither here nor there because this is not Warren Ellis anymore. This is Mark Millar. So with the Authority basically acting as the unofficial guardians of the planet, and they're saying, okay, we've got our eye on you. If you do anything we don't like, we're going to come down and we're going to spank you really good. With that going on as the new status quo, we have this group of superheroes that are very, very thinly veiled versions of the Avengers. You've got a character who is basically kind of like Captain America, except that he engages in necrophilia. And then you've got a guy who's kind of like Iron Man, except that he destroys a nursery full of babies. And it feels very Mark Millar. One of my big problems with Mark Millar is that he feels like he has to do things that are very shocking and very taboo just to keep you on the edge of your seat. Like, oh wow, that's edgy and that's really cool and that's really different than normal superhero comics. And most of the time I find it to just be immature and boring. He does a lot of stuff like that here, and it doesn't really make me think, oh wow, that's really awesome, that's really different from most superhero comics. Yes, it is different from most superhero comics, but not in a good way. I don't look at this and say, man, that's really cool. I look at this and think, man, he has the brain of a 13-year-old. Like, that's something that a 13-year-old would think that's really dark and edgy, but an adult should look at that and say that's really silly and immature. He's got a lot of stuff like that going on here, and that continues throughout Millar's run on this book. But with this particular volume, these guys are all working for this mad scientist guy. I hesitate to call him an evil mad scientist. His name is Dr. Krickstein, and he is basically a parody of Jack Kirby, which I don't really understand this, because if you're going to parody someone and you're going to paint them as being a villain, I don't understand why you would pick Jack Kirby. A lot of people have issues with Stan Lee and how he treated some of his co-creators of the Marvel Universe, so I don't know why you would choose Jack Kirby to be your big villain of this storyline if you're going to do that. Do that with Stan Lee. But anyway, Dr. Krickstein, apparently he worked with several presidents over the years, from Eisenhower all the way up to George Herbert Walker Bush, and then he was more or less dismissed as a crank, and so he went his own way. He created a whole bunch of these really crazy immoral supervillains, and then he wants to kidnap the reincarnation of Jenny Sparks. If Jenny Sparks was the spirit of the 20th century, this new version is the spirit of the 21st century, and he wants to control the 21st century. And I really like this idea. I don't necessarily like the way that it's being executed. I don't like seeing all of these really psychopathic, villainous versions of the Marvel Universe. I don't like that. I didn't have to see that. And I don't necessarily like the way that this story is concluded. Basically, Swift, she goes and meets Dr. Krickstein, and she says, hey, you want to control the 21st century. You want to make things better than what they were. Why don't you join us? We want to make the world a better place, too. And that's how the book ends. And that is an interesting flip on how you would usually deal with this evil mad scientist guy. I like the idea of they're not just going to punch him and throw him behind bars like normal superheroes would do, and this series really is all about doing things the way normal superheroes wouldn't do them, trying to find a new and better way. That's what this series is about. The problem I have with this is that Dr. Krickstein is responsible for the death of many people in this storyline. At the very least, the Iron Man equivalent, he destroyed a nursery full of babies, innocent babies who didn't have a chance to fight back, and this guy just killed all of them in a big explosion. And Dr. Krickstein basically gets a slap on the wrist, and he is going to get to make the world a better place with the Authority. I don't like that. I think you could have done it in a different way. I think if you had all these guys that Dr. Krickstein created, if they weren't as villainous and immoral as they were portrayed as being in this book, I think you could have gotten away with that. But as is, it makes me a little bit queasy in my stomach. It doesn't give me a good feeling like it did whenever I was reading the previous book by Warren Ellis and Brian Hitch. Overall, I like the first story in this book a lot better than the second story. I like some of the ideas that Mark Millar and Frank Quitely are working with here in the beginning of their run, but I don't think that they started off with as strong of a start as Warren Ellis and Brian Hitch did when they first started the series. So overall, those are my thoughts on the Authority under new management. I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.